Hi, everyone. I'm Allison Zamuda, and welcome to our session on how to start this new school year by building relationships in your classroom community. We just wanted to get you oriented before we started the slide deck on where you can find interesting and helpful resources. So it's learningpersonalized.com/Lower Merion. And when you're there, you can go right to the session here. Now, keep in mind, all of the sessions that Benna, myself, and Heidi are doing are all on this landing page. So you might have to scroll down a little bit to find where this session is located. So with that, we are going to go right into the slide deck, and we will get started by introducing Benna Kalik.
Hey, everybody. Good day. And it's a pleasure to be with you. And we're looking at how to start with our school this year, knowing that there are so many different variations on what's possible. So we're going to try to be, all of us, thinking flexibly, trying to be as adaptive as possible. So when we talk about an idea, we will always try to move it around a little bit and imagine, suppose we're actually on site together. Suppose it's a hybrid situation in which some are there and some are not there. And suppose we are back to being remote again. And so we're going to suggest, as we work together, that although we may be in any of these conditions, central to everything is that we all feel that we're a part of a classroom community. So let's just give some consideration to this. First, we clearly want to send you a virtual hug. And we want to say to you that we know that this has been a difficult struggle for all of us and continues to be. So what we're going to do is really begin to think about what are some of the most important ways that we can build this culture, this community. It's really, maybe we can say it's a community of uncertainty, but how do we build those relationships?
And part of that is trying to model the best we can right now for you on how to build a culture in the conversation. So we'll be with you for about 60 minutes time. And in that, we want to make it as interactive as possible. But really the idea too of planting seeds around what can you do to begin to plan building relationships. So you're imagining what the opening of school might look like several weeks or several months down the road. And at the same time, starting to pay attention to and reflect on how your own learning has shaped what it is that you're trying to enter your students into in the opening of the school year. And the heart of that is really grounded in building relationships. This is the heartbeat of personalized learning. It's also something that Benna and I crafted together in Students at the Center. And the opportunity to start paying attention to this, especially through the lens of the opening weeks of school, continues to potentially germinate some fresh ideas and new thinking to engage students in your classroom. So let's start with voice. Voice is really the power of having students feel like what they say matters. So when we're paying attention to voice, we are giving them the opportunity to have the floor, to share what they're thinking, what's on their mind, both concerns about things that have happened during the pandemic, during COVID-19, whether it's personal, whether it's academic, because they're all very intertwined and connected. So we're gonna move now to co-creation. Benna?
And when we're doing that, I think too often we think about the ideas. So I think in co-creation, we're not necessarily imagining that everything will be done synchronously. And also that sometimes in thinking about synchronous, people think that that's really the only idea behind that is that it's a whole class situation. But imagine this as thinking interdependently to construct and take actions on ideas, and you can still be working with small groups. Even when you're doing distance learning, you can still be working with one-to-one, with small groups, but the whole idea is that you're inviting students to come and join you in the design process so that you are really indicating that we are all going to work together and that everything isn't already done, but it's going to be done with you as we all think together.
So Benna also talked through the connection between co-creation and social construction. The intention of, again, building those networks and connections, but also really trying to leverage that co-creation and engagement with one another to genuinely reflect back on what am I learning about myself as part of this classroom culture. So the intention of moving through this experience starts to give you a frame or a way of what kind of rules, behaviors, norms might you need, not just something that can be posted on the wall in a classroom, but also starting to think about the kind of virtual settings and scenarios. Students also have a significant amount of experience in whether you've been using Zoom or Google Meet or a forum in Blackboard around the kinds of conversations they've engaged with in the spring. So all of a sudden, the students are very much capable right from the very beginning to begin to imagine what is healthy and helpful. And we'll talk about that a little more in the presentation a bit later. So we wanted to get you to think about first in the chat, what did you learn about yourself as an educator during the pandemic? What surprised you? Because forecasting ahead, we're trying to start to think about having it be a relatable first day experience where you're actually modeling right from the very beginning, regardless of how old your students are or what subject area you might teach, of what kinds of things you uncovered about yourself. So we'll give you a moment to take a beat, spend about 4 to 5 minutes, not only in drafting what you learned about yourself, what surprised you, but also to have a moment to think through what other people are saying. So again, about 4 to 5 minutes. So we're gonna officially pause the conversation. And then after 4 or 5 minutes, let's start resuming that.
So what we really are doing now is we're imagining that some of the things that you said in the chat were really ones that surprised you, maybe personally, and also perhaps surprised you about your students. And really thinking about the idea of what are the habits of mind? I know that in the district we have talked about the habits of mind. Everyone is aware of what they are. And yet we keep asking the question, how do we bring that into the everyday life of our work with our students? So this is a reminder that we are really saying that it's all about this social, emotional, and cognitive way of developing and building relationships. And the more we have this as a language in our classroom, the more we're able to make reference to it. So for example, when we're thinking about how we're going to be working together right now, there are some habits that perhaps really pop out to you. Ones that say, you know, as we're trying to work together, how will we be thinking interdependently? What options do we have? How can we think about that together? What I'm finding really exciting about many of the teachers I've been working with is that as they begin to see this and they're interested in co-creation, they begin to say, you know, these are some of the problems we can solve with the kids. Instead of having to have our own way of thinking about this, why not then invite them to think about how can we be thinking interdependently together? Now, in order to get this started in the classroom, we need to do what Art Costa and I would call booting up the habits, meaning we have to get the kids again aware of where they are and what they are. So here are a few examples of how some teachers have done this. Immediately, they did this because they were working in the remote situation.
Mm-hmm.
So the first example is
so Benna, one sec. I just want to interrupt for a second that when you're booting up the habits, as Benna just suggested here, it's incredibly important that you have some kind of coordinated effort in engaging in that. Because while it may be thrilling to do in the first period of a secondary day, it starts to become routine after the second time it's being asked of them. And the third time that it's being done, it's starting to feel like the teachers are not talking to one another. So the intention here is that quietly, from a secondary point of view, you might want to think about, how do you do this in a coordinated way? Perhaps teachers can actually engage in sharing this together as a collective team, for example, so that students can really think about the level of social construction and networking that's happening behind the scenes to continue to create a coherent experience that continues to go after fresh and imaginative thinking, as opposed to the staleness that comes when they're doing some kind of exercise with this for the 6th or the 7th time. So we want to start out with an example that comes from my daughter's experience, and then we'll move into the examples that Benno was just suggesting. So my daughter is a high school. She is now a rising junior. And one of the things that she engaged in during the COVID-19 is she really wanted to, she decided to learn how to play the guitar. The ukulele, I apologize. So she actually had guitar lessons probably about 6 or 7 years ago for about 6 months. And since then, the guitar got put into a case and has not been opened since. But she said, Mom, I really do want to learn how to play the ukulele. So I went online to Amazon, purchased the ukulele on her behalf, and then she basically taught herself how to play using YouTube. And the interesting thing is that she continued to engage in goal setting, what she wanted to do, as well as continuing to persist. And she persisted because she wanted to play particular songs, as opposed to learning in a traditional or typical way through learning one chord after another. So the idea of persisting and striving for accuracy, this is something she was very much tuned into as she continued to learn how to play the ukulele. And one of the reasons why she wanted to play the ukulele is that she felt it gave her a level of stress relief. Because things were so chaotic outside in the world, it gave her a sense that in this particular moment, it was a learning experience that she felt connected, and she felt like it continued to strengthen her love of music, as well as just to feel like she could use that to unwind. Benna?
The important part of that story, if you go back for a second, the important part of that story is really to also say, here's an opportunity to tell Zoe, or to remind Zoe of something she might not have been conscious of, which is basically, Zoe, when you were doing this, and if you looked at the chart, even if I were having a conversation with her, which of these habits of mine do you think really helped you to do this? Well, she might say, I really had to stick with it. Yeah, you might have really been persisting. You also, in learning how to do the ukulele, obviously, you were striving for accuracy. Now, my point is that building the language associated with the behavior, whether you're conscious of it or not, you want to bring it to consciousness, because that's one of the ways that we will be able to then say to her someday, perhaps, when she goes and she says, now I really do want to learn how to play the guitar better. We can say, now let's remember, when you were learning the ukulele, which were the habits that helped you most? So you're now able to transfer that from one situation to another. That's the idea is here, that you're reinforcing identification of the habits. In this next example, we have a teacher who said to the students, okay, tell me, so she named the habit first. So instead of discovering or identifying the habit as with Zoe, she asked the students, send me an example of when you persisted. And one of the things that she found that she was able to do was she had the students reflect on that by sending in slides, because they were all working remote. So they sent in slides with their stories. And as you can see, this story says that she was really persisting at this time, and she was really balancing by being able to look at this and to say, I persisted through this time. I was baking chocolate cookies. I got stuck on a question my parents asked. And so she was really saying, this is how this worked for me. In the next slide, what we see is a student who said, well, when I was out there doing my skateboarding, the way I persisted was I tried to do different workouts. So he's not saying I persisted only with skateboarding. He's saying I persisted in the pandemic by remaining physically alive and active. And so what we're seeing here is students saying, this is the way that I could apply a habit of mind to keep me going. So how might you use these ideas?
So in the chat, we're going to take, again, about 4 to 5 minutes for you to pause and reflect on the examples that you just saw, and how might you continue to introduce the habits in the first few days through a conversation such as this. So again, for the folks that have an informal facilitator, if you can pause for a minute, and then we'll resume after that chat conversation is over. So as you're starting to think through other ways of continuing to grow your introduction and getting to know one another, we wanted to take a moment for you to start imagining how you can share who you are as their classroom teacher. Again, the opportunity to get to know you when it's not done face-to-face necessarily, we have to start anticipating other ways that actually continue to capture the freshness of the opportunity. I think on some level, when we feel like what we're about to embark on is sad and worrisome, it does change the energy a little bit. So what kinds of things can you actually do when you have an opportunity to do a pre-recorded session as an option for connecting? What might you say about yourself? How might you actually employ other people around you to help tell your story? For example, you can actually have your kiddos, if you have children, pop in and say hi, or introduce, have the kids introduce them to your students. So the intention here of really trying to be a little bit playful, a little bit joyful in the approach, it sends a world of message to your students about other ways of continuing to connect. The other consideration that we want to bring up, and again, it's on the screen, that parents are actually going to be an audience just as much as the students if you're introducing yourself through a pre-recorded message. The other aspects would be engaging in a virtual conference so that you can connect, whether it's with the student and the family, or you're doing small group virtual conferences, or you're engaging with the entire class, of continuing to think about with students and potentially families, depending on how you want to set it up, the kinds of questions that you start to see on the right. So you might be modeling that potentially in your pre-recorded video, for example, or you start with that in your virtual conference, but you're inviting students and families to the table to share that level of thinking.
So what we're doing here is we're really saying that one of the clear ways that you start to build a culture of communicating is by you personally communicating and introducing yourself, and you're thinking interdependently. One of the things that I think most often teachers want to say in the very beginning is something about, here's the way we're going to work together. I'm introducing you, and I'm telling you about myself, and I'm telling you about what I really care about in my classroom. And one of the things that I really care about is the way we work together. Because I think when we learn together, we learn more together. So we're going to ask you and invite you, how can you tell us more about yourselves? What are some ways that we can learn from you? And the importance of this is that we want to know the students the way they see themselves. So we may even have some predetermined or pre-biased ideas because I remember that kid from last year. But we want to start fresh and we want to ask the kids, so how do you really see yourself? What is it that you want to tell us about you? And then in addition to that, we want them to be sure to talk about their strengths so that when kids are looking for, ooh, who could I work with in a group? That we know something about the talents and the strengths that the kids have and that they can share. And then we want to make sure that we're co-creating the idea that questions might arise that lead to investigations. And how do we make the scaffolds for that so that, again, in the social construction, you find the kinds of partnerships that are best going to serve the way that you're trying to learn and what you're trying to do. The connections, the interests, the aspirations, all of this is a part of who we are and what we bring to the table. When we think of this, our friend Yvette Jackson says, this is about equity consciousness. It's about being very aware that we know who we are in this room and the talents and strengths we bring to the table. So we can find this out by doing a whole class survey. In fact, some people find that they do this like in the first or second days of the class so that the teacher is getting to know who they are right away. So the first thing is they show us what they know about themselves. They show us how to learn, how they learn and what their strengths are. They provide us with the co-creating of ideas and they help find the connections. The survey needs to be asking questions that are really aiming in that direction. One example of that is something that's known as SOAR. And SOAR is a survey that really looks at the strengths. So if we could look at that for a moment. What we have here is a survey in which we're looking at the question of, and I'm giving some sample prompts here. So we're asking the student, for example, from strengths, what are you good at? And then look at the prompts that we have for that. What do you excel at? What are your greatest accomplishments? So notice we're looking at the strengths. The next thing we're looking at is opportunities. So when I'm in your class, what are some real opportunities that I can take advantage of? What partnerships can I make? How will I be able to see what kind of barriers have gotten in my way? And how can I learn with these new opportunities this year? My aspirations. What do I want to be? What do I see in my future? What do I imagine my future might be? And then finally, how will I know that it's happening? What evidence will I have? How will I meet my aspirations? So in a way, the structure of your survey can hit some of these example questions and get them to really talk about this. Now, if the survey only is a survey that I, the teacher, have privilege of knowing the answers to, then it's not going to really help the class networking. So how I summarize what I've learned from the summary, from the surveys, and how I'm able to then be able to share with our class as a whole. Here are some themes that I saw. Here are some interests. Oh, by the way, when I looked, I saw that Allison, you were very much interested in music. And then I saw that you, Jose, were also interested in music. You might want to find each other. So that I'm beginning to also find and help students find one another. So the summary from the surveys is as important for the class to learn from as it is from you, the teacher.
So it's also important that you're continuing to take anything that we're suggesting and step back and reflect on it. And you can start engaging in a riff on an existing idea. So you can take the idea of the survey, the SOAR model, for example, and say, you know what, it might even be better based on what Benna was just chatting about. Maybe students can actually do the survey, but that way they can actually rehearse some of the questions and then engage with a student that they want to know a little bit more about, somebody that they don't know that well. Sometimes it's pretty much the entire class. Other times it may only be a handful of students. But the intention here is that continuing to build social networking, to continue to build connections, are very much grounded in the tone and the tenor and the expectations that you have in the opening days of school. So it's not something that's necessarily controlled and reported out on to the teacher, and the teacher is doing the generalizations. Perhaps you want to engage and use this in a different way. And not only is that okay, it's absolutely welcomed. So any ideas that you continue to think through and share, you might also say in this one that we just came from, maybe it's not just helpful for the opening day of school. Oftentimes kids, especially in early adolescence, they change year to year, if not week to week. So potentially, might you use the survey again one or two other times during the year so that students can continue to reflect on their journey, their story of how I know myself better now than I did in the opening months of the school year. What am I interested in now in learning about, etc. So let's launch into an opportunity for you to look at a survey and begin to engage and converse in your chat around what questions might you want to include in your classroom in Lower Merion. So we're going to stop the presentation for a second and again, return you back into Lower Merion, where you can start to see the sample survey. So if you go here into the Lower Merion, click on the sample survey, and up pops a document for your consideration. So as you're going to take a look at this document, we're going to give you about 10 minutes or so to engage in this conversation. So first you want to go into this document, and then you're going to do some reading of what kinds of questions might be interesting or might be helpful when you're looking at the writing prompts. Obviously, the prompts don't necessarily have to be in writing. They can actually be something that students get ahead of time to engage in conversation with one another. They can be something that's done in a conversation, a chat, etc. The other thing you can do is go hit file, and then you can make a copy. If you like some of the ideas that are right here, no need to make more work for yourself. So again, continue to think through how you can grow your ideas and then share that together. So again, you're going to have about 10 minutes to read and write in the chat what are the questions that you're genuinely interested in finding more information about, to not only grow your understanding of the students, but also to grow the kind of connections within the classroom community. So 10 minutes, and we will see you back in the presentation. So welcome back. We are going to pick up where we left off, which we're almost there. So you've examined the survey, you shared some of the ideas and the questions that you appreciated in the chat. And again, continue to think about making sure that this isn't a redundant enterprise, especially for my secondary colleagues. Again, to try to make sure that you're getting fresh thinking as opposed to stale thinking or over-rehearsed thinking. So as we're moving into this next piece of getting to know the students, Benna?
Well, we're thinking here that getting to know your students, again, as we said earlier, doesn't have to be whole class. So think about your options. When might you want to have a one-to-one, meaning a conference with a student? When, and especially when you keep making the mention of the secondary, I would certainly say developmentally, for the young teachers of younger children, a one-to-one conference sometimes is the most important way to get to know the student because they're very shy. And especially they're very shy when they're on remote learning. Now, shy doesn't mean they don't want to talk, yak, 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 but it does mean that they're shy to really get centered, to be able to say and answer a question. So you want to be able to keep their focus and keep their attention. So a one-to-one sometimes is really the best way. And then with small groups, you also have the option sometimes to just have a couple of students instead of having all of them. Now, even whether you're on site, whether you're hybrid, whether you're remote, just remember that there are different ways that you can manage this. And we're really suggesting strongly that the first few weeks of school, you are really creating the conditions for the rest of the year. So don't think that you need to jump right into all of the academic work in the absence of really taking some time to build these relationships. However, the relationships can be built around the academic work.
Yes.
So you could have a one-to-one conference with each student saying, so tell me a little bit about how you are as a writer or as a reader, or what are some things you know about yourself? I think all of that becomes very, very important. So in order to do that, you need to be listening with understanding and empathy. So you have to really be willing to say, I'm going to really wait a few moments when I'm talking with someone. Allison and I are going to model 3 key opportunities for listening that really are important. So it's not really opportunities, but it's really key behaviors. So the first is to pause, to remember that you don't need to jump right in. You can just wait, because very often for many, many people, they're not high verbal, they don't keep talking, but sometimes they step back for a moment, they get reflective, they need to think. And often we get very anxious with that pause, like, wait a minute, what's happening? Did we lose them? But give yourself a few moments, maybe just count to 30 or 40 or 50 seconds. And then when you see that nothing else is happening, you can paraphrase. You can begin to say, is this what you meant? Here's what I can tell you I heard. Is this accurate? And then you can start asking questions to probe for deeper understanding, because your point is to bring out their thinking, not to project your own thinking onto them. So we're going to model an example of this so that you can see what it's like. So Allison will be the student, I will be the teacher, and I'm just going to ask her a question and kind of model what I mean by pause, paraphrase, and to probe. And you can take note of it, and after we're finished, you can take a few moments to post in the chat what you noticed about the kinds of questions I was asking. So I'll just begin by saying, Allison, we've had this period in which we haven't really been together. So as you think about that, was there anything that you learned about yourself? Like, what did you find that there was a special place at home that you really liked to study in? Tell me a little bit about that.
So I'm role modeling a student right now. So, and I'm going to role model something that you might hear upper elementary to high school students. So one of the things that I did is I did all of my work on my bedroom floor. And so my bedroom floor was like really hard. So I tried to play around with cushions or how I could keep myself a little bit comfortable. But at some point, you know, after a couple hours of work sprawled out on the floor, I had to get up and move. And sometimes I wanted to move not just in my bedroom, but to get outside. And I was really frustrated because of the fact that I wasn't allowed to do that. My parents didn't want me to.
So when you think about that, tell me more about the idea that you needed to move. Did you notice anything about why you needed to move, or what would really help you to move?
Well, I know that my back started hurting, and like I just started to get a crick in my neck. So to get to move, to loosen myself up was super helpful. And you know, I think one of the things that I tried to do was some like PE stretches that I learned in gym class to see if that actually made a difference.
So as you were realizing that you needed to move, one of the things that you also realized was the movement needed to be released by something like some activity that actually loosened you up, like your back was beginning to bother you, other things were bothering you, and you remembered something that you learned from physical education class, and that was really helpful to you. So
Yeah. And so I also started doing the Chloe Ting workouts because I thought, you know, while we're quarantined, I may get in better shape too. So that was super cool because I felt like I was part of a bigger community of, you know, other people that were doing the same thing. So,
So what you also learned about yourself was a couple of things. So the first thing that I'm learning about you that you learned about yourself was that you noticed that you needed to really find different places, that being just on in one place in your room wasn't sufficient. You also learned that it wasn't such a good thing to go outside because in fact your parents didn't, well, it might have been a good idea, but your parents didn't want you to do so. And then what you also learned about yourself was that you needed to move, that movement was part of what you needed, not just a different place, but actual movement. So you started getting interested in going back to some of your physical education and thinking about that, which brought you to finally realizing that maybe moving in a group was going to be helpful. And how could you move in a group? And you decided that you would tune into something like, I assume that was a video, is that right?
yep.
Yeah, so okay. So you tuned into a video in which you actually were able to move and feel that movement and almost imagine that you were with others. So
Yep.
that was really helpful to learn. Thanks for sharing that, Allison.
Thanks. So as you're starting to think about the conversation that we just had, if you again can please post in the chat the some of the ways that Benna continued to connect with me personally, but also continuing to demonstrate pause, paraphrase, and probe. So again, about 3 minutes or so to enter that in, and we'll see you on the next slide.
So here we
So,
are.
yep. So
Here
as
we are on
we
the next
are
slide.
starting, yep. And so here we are on the next slide. And as we're starting to wind down, Benna will share a couple of other strategies for how to continue to connect. Benna?
So here we are now, and that was a one-on-one conversation, but how about a small group? And it actually, that could have been a focus group. And we might have actually had 3 or 4 students together. And Allison would have shared, and then someone else would have shared, and 3 or 4. It would not work for an entire class to do this because by the time you went to the 4th person, you would probably be dropping over. But if you can continue the focus group, and one of the things that I've found often helps is to give a good prompt. So sometimes you might say, you know, some people said that being in remote learning, actually I learned more because I was able to be isolated and I didn't have to be with other kids. And so I actually paid better attention, I found. And other people said, I really didn't do well with it. I got distracted. I started going to social media. It really didn't help me very much. And I really missed the opportunity to think together with other people. I needed more collaborative learning. What did you think? And how did you respond to it? And the point of something like that is that when you give the extremes, some people say one thing and some people say another. What actually happens is that you discover that wherever you are in that continuum, it's okay.
Benna, you want to talk about the conferencing as well?
Yeah. So on the conferencing, what we do is we shift, just as I really could have been as easily not in a focus group, but in a conferencing situation with Allison. And here's where I can be a little bit more personal and I can actually ask some things like not only where did you find the best place to study, which was the question I asked her, but what concerns do you have as you think about this? Now, I wouldn't have asked for concerns necessarily in a focus group, although I might have, but I think I could get even more personal about it when I'm one-on-one. So a one-on-one conferencing situation allows me to get just a bit more intimate with the student and also to know what are her goals, where is she trying to go? And that's something that I think in the shared experience, I might modify.
Absolutely. And again, you can also parallel this in whether you're doing a pre-recorded video or you're engaging in a conversation, because being in a virtual learning environment was very different for everyone involved. And there are moments where there is real relatability that you're demonstrating, that you're sharing, that potentially will open the student up more rather than feeling like they're an interview subject. So the next part is thinking about guidelines for respectful behaviors. And one more time, this is something that we have to continue to pay attention to, especially when we're working through different ways of engaging with one another. Whether we're in a hybrid situation where students and you are missing the kids that aren't there, whether we're in a virtual situation where we're engaging with a small group or an entire class in a synchronous way, or where you're engaging in an asynchronous way, where there's an opportunity for students to still demonstrate care for themselves, for one another, and the learning environment. So the intention here is to really starting to focus on creating psychologically safe places for learning and the habits of mind that are most integral in doing that. So here's a concrete example that Benna will share around something like a Zoom meeting. But again, in every avenue of a learning environment, whether it is through a virtual face-to-face call or in a physical environment or some other platform, this is something that you might too begin to imagine and create. Benna?
So what we're really saying is, again, we're trying to model for you the opportunity to see how easily you can integrate the habits, excuse me, how easily you can integrate the habits of mind rather than feeling that there's something else that you do at some other time. Because right now, especially, the habits of mind really are, as we have often said, they're what you do when you don't know what to do. So now here we are thrown into this situation of remote learning where a lot of our learning is on Zoom. How are we going to become interdependent while we're all looking at little squares of everybody's face? So we thought that these three habits were really most important. And the reason why, if you'll show the next slide, the reason why is because we can set Zoom rules, for example. And these Zoom rules, needless to say, are as good for whether we're in class together or not. But I think it's really important to pay attention to how we're going to work when we're in remote learning.
Yeah.
So we can be asking ourselves, what does it mean to listen with understanding and empathy when there are 6 or 7 other people on the Zoom call? Or perhaps 20 people on the Zoom call in which you might not invite so much discussion. But if you do, how do I listen with understanding and empathy? How do I make sure that I'm asking and paraphrasing before I start to add my own ideas? Then thinking and communicating with clarity and precision. I need to be sure that I'm trying to say what I'm trying to say with clarity as much as I can. Now, actually, it may be that what's most helpful to me is when my peers or other people are asking me something. But sometimes I just may need to have the time to clarify my own thinking. I can
Absolutely.
start with an idea, and then if you just as a teacher or as another student would say to me, I'm not sure I get what you mean. And then I can begin to say with more clarity what it is I'm trying to say. So the questioning and the posing problems, being able to say also, I have a question. I'm not sure I understand something. If someone is presenting something and it poses a problem, am I able to say, this is posing a problem for me, or I get what you're trying to say and it raises a question for me. Here's something that I'm wondering about. Notice that the Zoom rules encourage interaction with one another's thinking. They are not just to say, you've got your little square, it's your turn, and now you can say something you want to say, and then the next person doesn't even have to build on that. So how do
So,
we really
yep.
create that?
And I think the intention here is that knowing the structure of the platform you're using, whether it's getting kids to learn how to use that hand wave in Zoom, or if you're not using Zoom, just get an opportunity to learn the software a little bit better so that you can continue to use the structure of how that's built in. So for example, when do you want them to engage in the chat versus putting a hand up? How might you actually put somebody else in charge of monitoring the chat so that you have one student unmuted or two students unmuted and the rest of the class is muted, so that they can begin to pose questions to you as a classroom teacher if you're engaged in direct instruction. So those are a couple of different ways of engaging with it. And as we're wrapping up this session, one more piece is starting to pay attention to how you're encouraging students to document their own learning. This is a great opportunity to engage in some level of personalizing by starting to say, begin to explore and think about what works for you. So you might need to do a couple of quick lessons on sketchnoting and journaling and Jambars and other ways of documentation. But again, begin to give the students an opportunity to engage in experimenting and exploring and identifying what works best for them to capture their thinking as they're engaged in a conversation, whether it's through a face-to-face or a virtual or an asynchronous experience. So that's the end of this slide deck.
Just to say, this would certainly be true. I'm sorry, Allison, but this would certainly be true whether you're in class or you're not. Really learning and helping the kids learn how to document learning is really important. I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's right. And so this is the end of the slide deck. So again, please, based on the conversations that you've just shared with one another in the chat, continue to think about what other ways can you actually take action, whether you're generating ideas and collaborating with others, whether you're beginning to design your own survey. But again, keep in mind that you're continuing to share ideas with your colleagues, as well as avoid redundancy when it comes to doing a couple of things in secondary where it can get very repetitious for kids. All right, thanks so much. And again, if you're joining us in another session, we'll see you there.
Thank you.